Is ZEV dead? What do you think, Nick?
I don't think ZEV is dead for two reasons. One is the need to decarbonize is still as pressing as ever, even more pressing. So that's in no doubt at all. So we have to get to low CO2 emissions. And but the other thing is, I don't think the government is yet ready to give up on it completely. What we will see in the next few weeks through this consultation will be a fudge in almost certain terms that they'll try and preserve as many of the sort of totemic bits about it, like the 2030 phase out of internal combustion engines, but they'll really dilute it behind the scenes to give the industry an easier ride. And it'll postpone the day of the real crunch to two years' time, something like that, when the manufacturers then are really up against the phase out date. But I would also add is actually the UK potentially has a get out of jail not quite free card, which is
Yeah,
if we in large numbers of subsidized Chinese electric vehicles, then we could get there.
yeah,
It
of course.
would be at
I
a
mean,
cost,
yeah.
but we could get there, unlike Europe, which has an industry to preserve.
Is it the? I mean, people have seen the. Well, I assume it is the closure of Luton and the consolidation. Don't know how many jobs will go because Stellantis have partly blamed that on ZEB. You've seen Ford cut 800 jobs. You've seen warnings, and basically, even today, stories been published that show we published them showing that only three manufacturers met the ZEV target for this year, which is 22%. I think most of them met the minimum target. The problem is, I think that the public and the policymakers are diametrically opposed because the public wants something that's cheap, affordable, and easy. And although anyone who's driven an EV, and I've driven one, they're brilliant, they're lovely, and they're wonderful, they're not any of those things at present. Is there a big sort of get out of jail card for the government, apart from what you said about flooding it with, BYD and other Chinese imports? Is it possible that they could say, actually, let's go to hybrid? Let's take hybrid and say, at least that gets us to reduce a lot more of the emissions. The public would probably buy that much quicker because I can already see around where I am, more people are buying hybrids, not electric. But is that an option the government could have? Because they're not zero emission, are they?
No, that's the problem. Well, from a reducing CO2 point of view, in reality, that's an extremely good solution and one that we've pointed to for many years now. That because hybrids are hardly more expensive than normal vehicles, they don't require any behavioral change, and particularly full hybrids without the plug. No behavioral change,
Yeah.
no infrastructure issue at all. Yet you get 25 to 30% CO2 reduction off the bat for virtually no cost. And supporting manufacturers who are quite big in manufacturing in the UK. So that is the obvious solution if you're serious about getting cost-effective decarbonisation quickly. But the problem is that would require legislative change that cannot be accommodated under the current net zero laws. And the government, I imagine, will not want to reopen that or have to undo existing legislation. So they'll fight and fight to not do that, even though it is the logical solution.
So the problem is, if the public don't buy, how can the manufacturers meet these targets? Unless, as you say, we just say to hell with it, let loads of cheap Chinese EVs come in.
Well, there is one, and I put it in inverted commas, easy way for the manufacturers to meet their targets, and it's simply to ration the sales of internal combustion engines. So it's maths. So if you need to do
Yeah.
22% EVs, that's very easy. You just reduce the number of ICEs you sell, and you can get there mathematically. What that involves is then real people are not able to buy the cars they want. So effectively, you'll get a 1970s style sort of queuing system, like we had queuing for mortgages and whatever. So back to wartime rationing, in essence, which then sets up a battle between the industry and the government to who takes the blame for discontent from consumers not being able to buy cars.
The problem I feel is that, we've discussed it before, is that there is a zealousy about EVs. It's the only way to do it. And and I totally think they are the solution in the future. but right now they are not. So how do we get around this? Because everyone wants to cut emissions. I'm sure the public doesn't want to have tailpipe emissions, but they can't afford. They're not buying it, right? The consumer is voting, right? It's simple. And I think you'll probably know the stats better than me, but sort of, I think the last figures I saw, sort of 80 or 90% of EVs that have been sold to businesses so far.
with
So
massive subsidy, with
how
massive
much?
subsidy, with massive subsidy.
With massive subsidy, yeah.
That's
So
that's the crucial thing.
yeah. So at present, if you want to change that massive shift, just like we got everyone to get wearing seatbelts, I remember that when I was a kid, my dad used to wear it. You got everyone to stop smoking, in restaurants, you have a law. Do they then just double down? Is that the other way around it, where they just go, you know what, sod you, you're all going to have to just go and buy them, and the law gets tougher, and as you say, manufacturers just stop making them.
Well, yes. So, I mean, I think this is a really profound question for the government and all British governments of the last few decades, which is where do we want to actually create our economic wealth from? I mean, the bottom line is really you cannot build mass market electric vehicles in the UK because our labor costs are too high,
Yeah.
particularly our energy costs are too high, and the environmental regulations are too strict. You can't do it without making cars a lot more expensive. And people don't want to do that because then they won't be able to travel, they won't be able to buy what they want. So the temptation will be to allow in these subsidized Chinese vehicles. I mean, it's exactly equivalent to the solar industry where, we're a major consumer of solar panels, but they're all made, or mostly made in China. We cannot possibly build solar panels economically in the UK. So the honest position that the government could take is simply to say, actually, we cannot possibly compete in the mass market for making electric cars. We're not going to try to. We're going to let these Chinese cars in to decarbonize. And we're going to reallocate our effort and resources and workforce to this other industry that we can compete in. I know, biotech or whatever it is. And that's why, everyone bandies around the term industrial strategy. But now is the moment. If you really believe in an industrial strategy, that is what is needed now. And we need an honesty to say we cannot compete in this area, but we can compete over here, and we're going to switch our resources. And it's very sad that 1,100 people in Luton are being made redundant, but we're going to help retrain them in a completely different industry where we can compete. If they don't come out honestly and say, and bring out that fundamental choice, then it's just going to be blurring it and setting up another crisis in a couple of years' time.
And the final point is that probably means these manufacturers, who are all kind of foreign anyway, Stellantis and BMW and Mercedes, they'll just say there's no point building anything here, will they? They'll just pack up.
So yes and no. I mean, that is the big difference between us and Europe. We employ lots of people in the car industry and in the R&D, but we don't own any of the profits from the
No.
manufacturing of cars. So in a sense, we have less invested in this sector than Germany and France does. But we can think back to the model of the 1980s, where we positioned ourselves as a very good place for Japanese-owned car manufacturers to build their cars. We could mimic a similar thing like that for electric vehicles and just try and attract as much inward investment from China as possible. That would be, in the circumstances, probably the most honest and the least bad solution. The worst solution of all, which is I have a terrible feeling where this may end up, would be the decade before that, which was the nationalisation of the UK car industry, the creation of British Leyland and then Austin Rover, etc.
Awful cars.
To try and create a competitive position which was rapidly fading and turned into a very expensive and embarrassing disaster. There is, underlying this, effectively a creeping nationalisation of the car industry that could happen. And I think that's the route we do not want to go. It's best to be honest about where we can compete, attract the inward investment we can, preserve the jobs in final assembly of vehicles that we can, and reallocate our effort elsewhere.